Thanks everybody for joining us today. I recognise there'll be a lot of people joining us live and also recorded. So welcome to you, whether it's morning, afternoon or evening your time. I'm really delighted to be presenting another one of your webinars over what's obviously been a busy and challenging 2020 for everybody. And the key today is going to be the stories, the wonderful rich stories we're going to have shared from around the world. And so I'm very lucky to be joined by three panelists for this lunchtime session. The topic, as you all know, is leadership and learning in the time of crisis. And I don't think we've had too many crises as big or as interconnected as the ones we face today. There's so much leadership required that frankly we're really not getting. And I've actually written down a couple of quotes that I think speak to the situation really well. The first is that in times of crisis, good leaders emerge. And that's a quote from Rudy Giuliani, actually, funny enough, the former mayor of New York and one of the lawyers to President Donald Trump. Actually, I don't think we've seen too much good leadership emerge so far, certainly. I do think there's something to be said for a kind of crucible of challenging situations that really promotes people to positions of leadership and shows who really is their leadership in their community, in their local government, national government, or internationally. What I think is a better quote, though, is this one, and it's from JFK. And it says, when written in Chinese, the words crisis are composed of two characters. And those two characters in Chinese alphabet are danger and opportunity. And I think the three panelists we have today actually speak to the opportunity that there is in our world and in our community today. As entrepreneurs, as community leaders, NGOs, businesses alike, the opportunity, I think, is here if we grasp it and form our own consensus rather than wait for a consensus to form for us. So some really exciting role models today. So excited to get going. A quick introduction to myself, then I'll introduce our panelists, get them to introduce themselves. And of course, a big part of the session will be your questions. So I'll be making sure we have enough time throughout the session for questions from both social media submitted in advance, and we have some great questions already stored, as well as any questions that are submitted live. So my name is Peter Ptashko. I've been working in impact entrepreneurship for around 15 years now, initially at foundations and networks, funding and supporting entrepreneurs all over the world. And in the last couple of years, I've forged my own business called Cambio, which means change in Spanish. And the focus of the work I do is actually primarily around coaching, working directly with entrepreneurs to help them solve business challenges and really hone in on what their social mission is, amplify and maximize that. So I work with smaller organizations looking to scale, NGOs, businesses, corporates, really with that goal of to be unleashing the potential and talent in people who already have it. And there's lots of talent on show today, so that's enough from me. I'm going to pass over to our panelists. I'm going to start with our first panelist, who I'm going to ask to go first, and that is Edem Ossai, who is the founder of MAYEIN. Apologies if I mispronounce any of the words today. As somebody with a complicated second name, Ptashko, I'm used to this, and I hopefully give me a bit of credit for that. She's from Nigeria. I'm going to get her to introduce herself first. So Edem, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's morning here in Nigeria. My name is Edem Ossai. As Peter said, I work in Nigeria. I am a young woman who founded an organization called Mentoring Assistance for Youths and Entrepreneurs Initiative. It's a mouthful, so it's easy to just say MAYEIN. And basically, I have been combining the tools of research and communication for development, as well as organizational development for the past 15 years to promote positive youth development, children's rights, as well as education for all. So we lead strategies in community settings to ensure that we attain the Sustainable Development Goals, especially goals 4 and 5, which is education for all and basically gender equality. I've been doing this now, combining the tools I talked about, and I'm very excited to be on the panel. I'm very excited to be part of this very crucial conversation. As Peter has said, the crisis has rocked and hit us also here in Nigeria and affected the nonprofit landscape, the NGO landscape. Over the course of the conversation, I'll be happy to share my perspectives on how the crisis has impacted and how I have had to rise to new levels of leadership to navigate this new terrain and to thrive and to ensure that impact continues. And indeed, I demonstrate the level of resilience that the times require. So I'll be happy to share my lessons over the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Edem, getting us going there. So our second panelist is Jean-Michel Habeneza, is founder of iDebate from Rwanda. So Jean-Michel, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jean-Michel, and I'm the founder and director of iDebate Rwanda. iDebate Rwanda is a debate program here in Rwanda that teaches students the art of public discourse. I believe in a world where the world is becoming more polarized. We are hoping to teach our students how to disagree on policy without resorting to violence. Currently, we work with 35 schools in Rwanda with a plan that in the next 10 years, we're going to work with 1,000 schools. And I'm really excited to be on this discussion, and I look forward to answering questions and also learning a lot from the panelists and everyone who joined this call. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jean-Michel. And last but by no means least, we have Benjamin Rukwenjie. It's my least effective pronunciation so far, I think. Founder of Boundless Minds from Uganda.
Thank you so much, Peter. My name is Benjamin Rukwenjie from Uganda, where I am the founder of Boundless Minds. Like you just said, Boundless works in the school-to-work transition space, supporting young people post-high school and at university and in technical vocational education with work readiness and entrepreneurship skills training, volunteer and entry-level placement, and mentor matching that enables them to start the process of getting into employment before they leave school, so that then it's easy for them to manage that transition. And I am excited to be on the call with Edem and Jean-Michel to basically share our experience as Boundless, but also from Uganda, where, you know, as some of you might know, we are the second youngest country with an average age of 15 years. And we have young people starting businesses all the time, but also our work as Boundless is to get as many young people to start enterprises and initiatives while they are still in school. School has been closed here from March. So there's been disruptions in terms of not just our work, but in terms of like the entrepreneurship ecosystem. So I am looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Benjamin. Thank you all for your introductions. Really interesting. I wanted to start by saying I think I may have already seen more leadership on this call than I have in much of the press and in many of our national governments today. But it has, on a serious note, been obviously a hugely challenging 6-month period. I often use the analogy that we're all in this crisis together. We're all in this kind of choppy sea, to use that kind of analogy of sort of, you know, boats and seafaring. But the challenge with that is that we're definitely not all in the same boat. We're all in our own little boats. Some of them are more sturdy than others. Some of them are taking on water more rapidly than others. Some are much better protected than others. And what I really want to hear from our panelists today and understand better is actually that leadership that's forged in a crisis. The last 6 months has been challenging for really very many people around the world in very many different kinds of ways. And so I want to start by asking the first question to our panelists is, can you tell me an example of a difficult moment, a crisis that you have faced in your personal life, in your business this year, and how have you tackled that? What are the big learnings for you, and how have you come back stronger? How are you building back stronger from that? And I want to come to Edem first for your answer.
Thank you, Peter. So, well, this year, you say. Of course, I think the uncertainty began for us really around March this year. We had been following the global news. It was evident that there was, you know, a virus that had come into the scene. But the truth is, from a Nigerian point of view, it didn't feel like an immediate threat. However, by February, the situation had escalated, and by March, you know, we were all contemplating lockdowns, basically closures of offices. And so I think it was at that moment that my organization came face to face with, you know, the fact that we couldn't continue business as usual. One of the things I think in previous readings and just general, you know, studies around crisis, I had learned, you know, that when you find yourself in a sudden disruption, the first thing to do is to pause, when the earthquake ends, find a point of reference. I think I found myself as a leader in that sort of, moment of a total, complete disruption and no actual sense of, dimension or no actual sense of grounding. Suddenly we were hearing, schools were closing. My organization works primarily with schools. If schools close, I have very limited contact with the, targets that I intend to support and empower. Also, we were faced with the reality that we couldn't continue to converge in the office to lead strategy, to plan, to, basically conceive of implementation steps. So how would we continue to run an office that requires staff, coming together in one place and doing the think tank processes that we do in a way that is safe? At that moment, the first thing we decided was safety first. Everyone was panicked, and so the most immediate concern was, how do I stay alive? As a leader responsible for the people in my team, the most immediate concern for me was how to give them, that sense that I am also conscious of their safety, and I, will uphold or respect that commitment to their safety. And so we had to think immediately, how do we let people work from home or stay away from coming to the office, but still conduct office? And then we began to think, with the limited resources available to us, what can we leverage? Then we discovered there was a platform called Zoom. Prior to this time, yes, Zoom existed, but Zoom wasn't so popular in the Nigerian, at least from the NGO perspective. Maybe corporate offices, especially the large ones, were already using it, but certainly not at my level. At that point, we had to then check the scene to see what tools. And it was our communication officer who said, oh, excuse me, there's a particular tool that is affordable, that is easy to, everyone to just install it on their phones. And we started simulating it before the government declared the closure of office. So we already started operating. We had a policy that would require people to only come into the office twice a week before the situation of the lockdowns had been introduced. We anticipated ahead of time that this was imminent. So how do we prepare ahead of time? So that was the first thing that we had already started testing that allowed us to, thrive, I would say, or at least weather the situation when eventually the crisis hit its peak. So we had started that. Also, the schools were closed, but we needed to still have contact with our teenage populations. We began to think the only way we could continue to reach them was through our community centers. We would have to therefore miniaturize our programs. In other words, we would have to scale down our programs to a size that basically did not represent a threat. How do we, in a situation without a lockdown, we would be able to converge students in large numbers to deliver, for instance, digital literacy training, which is one of the flagship programs that we run. But with this situation ahead of us, we knew that that wasn't going to be possible. So we decided that we would use the community centers to continue to establish linkages with our teenage populations to hear the emerging challenges. So we decided, rather than continue as usual with our regular set of programs, we would go into a new needs assessment. Since there is a crisis and teenagers are forced to stay at home, they're no longer going to school, they're forced to be in domestic settings that could be either favorable or non-favorable. We would therefore use those centers to communicate with teenagers to hear what are the specific challenges that you experience in a crisis. So those were two things that were our focus. One, keep everybody safe, still communicating. And three, continue to establish or maintain a continuous link between the teenagers. And we decided that our community centers would be a perfect approach. So we set up call centers in the community center. Through phone calls and a database, we're able to continuously phone our teenagers across the city, hear what's happening with them, collate the information about what they're recording as specific challenges, and begin to plan new programs ahead of time. So I think these were three critical steps that we took that we have seen have served my organization in terms of how to still stay alive, to still be relevant in a time like this. I'll pause now.
Thank you, Edem. Really, really interesting. And the first word that I think you used in that is responsibility. So your responsibility to the people that work with and for you. Before you talk then about engagement and perhaps showing that kind of thought and action that often represents traditional leadership. But that responsibility came first. So I'd love to explore that more as we go. But before we do that, Jean-Michel, I'd love to hear your story of how you and your organization have been surviving and thriving, hopefully, through COVID-19.
Thank you, Peter. I would say that for us as an organization, the last 6 months have been quite an experience. One of our friends usually says that you would think iDebate is the one that provoked COVID-19 because of how productive they've been. I would say that a few things of what we have learned. I think as a leader, I saw the importance of asking questions of your team and asking questions of different people you work with. To think that you will come up with a solution is quite arrogant, and it's actually not. You are underutilizing your people. I think when we were able to say, listen, whether we feel pity for ourselves, whether we feel whatever, this is a situation that the whole world is going under. So what are we going to do with that? So the first one is asking a lot of questions of my team. And I found that when you ask your team a lot of questions and they feel like they're part of something, they take responsibility, and it takes the weight away from you. And then you're able to work as a team on the same vision. I've also noticed the importance of communication. In this crisis, I think over communication. It's constantly communicating with people, telling them this is what we are doing, and this is what is happening, and what can we do. But last, I think that quick action. So when the debates, when the Rwanda went into a full lockdown in the end of March, and in the weekend before we went into a full lockdown, we were supposed to start a new league in a new province. We're supposed to have another 46 schools, and we were excited about it. And we're hoping that this is, after 8 years of functioning, this is this one time we're expanding, and we're excited about it. But we had to, because of safety reasons, we had to cancel that. And then from there, we found ourselves that everyone is at home, and what do we do? But then we noticed that in our WhatsApp groups that had, 250 and a lot of teenagers, they would still try to find themselves, they'll always find something to debate about. Many of them were debating about, is COVID a scam? Or they were debating about things that teenagers really want to debate about. And then we thought, but what if we're able to create competitions where they would use WhatsApp and they would use calls or whatever they could use. What can we do? So with the team, we started we organized a competition, and we were hoping that students are just going to continue this activity, learning how to do research, and because also they have a lot of time and they're at home not doing anything. So when we opened it up, we had about 325 students and young people participate, which was way more than we thought. And but it also presented itself as an opportunity. It says, well, it might not be what we had hoped for, but this still works, right? And then also the other avenue that this crisis provided for us is because there was no traveling and because everyone was at home, we thought of many creative ideas. So for example, why not engage in debate with people from all over the world? So we started having what we call the Global Debate Series, and we had our students debate against, Pepperdine University. We had students debate against some schools in the UK and in Tanzania, and all of that because, again, everyone was at home, and if we could have access to internet, we could at least still have that engagement. And we have also used this time as an extended, I would say like an extended holiday, and say, okay, what if we use this time to build our teams and our volunteers? So from the start of the pandemic in March until now, we have held about 22 training sessions for all our volunteers and trainers and anyone who could attend. And surprisingly enough, in a lot of our trainings, some had as much as 75 participants, some had and the lowest was about 25 to 20 participants. And we had participants from 6 African countries, which would not, the cost of that, if it was not that we were using internet, would have been great. So I think that this, once we're able to let go of what could have been and should have been, and then just embrace what is, and then figure out how do we pivot, how do we use whatever is available to still accomplish our goals, maybe not in the way that we hoped for, but it's still good enough. I think I have learned just to accept good enough is still okay, at least in this period.
Thank you so much, Jean-Michel. And I think what we're hearing there is sort of optimistic glass half full approach to the opportunity that I mentioned at the very beginning, that springs from a crisis. But what I also noted there from what you said was there were a number of steps you took before that pivot, before the actions within the business to change the dynamic of how you deliver what you do. Those were asking difficult questions and over communicating. And again, I don't necessarily think we've seen as much of that in the wider world as perhaps we could have done. Clear communication and asking tough questions so that we can really reflect on what is it we need to do to rise to this challenge. So thank you so much for that contribution. And last but again, by no means least, Benjamin, if you could tell us about your experience for the last 6 months and how you've got to the point you're at now.
Thank you, Peter, Edem, and Jean-Michel. You know, what's interesting is that I feel like so because the three of us work in the same spaces, I feel like that we've been struggling with the same things, and yet leadership has come out in pretty much the same way. I don't know if that makes sense. So this is a funny story. Well, it's not funny, but it's a story I like to tell. At the beginning of this year, we were talking to a partner and asking them to, fund a digital platform because we wanted to move our content and resources online for students to access. And the partner basically told us that they didn't think that digital platforms were a viable investment idea. So they were not going to fund it, but if we could figure out a way to train 2,000 young people across the year, then they would, give us the resources. And I remember telling him that I don't think that we could guarantee quality in the way that we train if we trained 2,000 people offline. And well, so that discussion ended. And then in, I think May, so the lockdown happens in March. Then in May, the partner writes to us and says, you guys, that thing we talked about in January, did you ever work on it? What's going on? So we explained what had happened and stuff. But so what had happened is that when they closed the schools, we also put a stop to all our programs and started investing in our alumni. So what we would do essentially is so the alumni would decide what topic they want to discuss, because they are in they were in 3 WhatsApp groups. So they would decide what topic they want to discuss. So whether it's renewable energy or to understand let's say, development, international development or marketing or whatever. So they decide this is what we want to discuss. Then we would find a professional, add them to the WhatsApp group. So the alumni would basically pick up questions, decide on what questions they have and prepare them. So we would add a professional to the alumni groups. Then they have an engagement for about an hour and a half in which the students ask the questions and the professional responds. So they have all of these career questions that they're asking and the professional response. So usually it would be text or audio responses. And but we also knew that we couldn't just be working with our alumni. So we had created a blog site where one of the alumni would basically transcribe the session in the WhatsApp groups, and then it's run on the blogs. So this worked really well, and the reason why it was working, the reason why we didn't even try platforms like Google Meets or Zoom or whatever is because the students struggle, the young people struggle with data pricing and infrastructure. So it's not possible that you can have them or all of them. We tried at the start, and I think you'd have like 5 or 7, and yet you'd keep seeing them online on WhatsApp, right? So when we went to WhatsApp, it blew out. Like you'd have this session and the time comes to an end and they are not yet done. So we thought, okay, so when the partner, the other partner that I told you about from January, so when they reached out, we said, you know, we actually think we could work, we could train, we've been doing these sessions online with alumni, but we have this content set up to run online anyway in the way that we had pitched it to you. So if you could invest some funding for us to pilot with 100 students, and we see how that will work. So they gave us some funding, which we used to do a pilot with 100 students. And it was a huge success because we were using WhatsApp, which is where the students are anyway, all the time. So when we reported back to them, they said, okay, this is very interesting. We didn't know that this could work. I also laughed, reminding them how they'd said that the move to online was never going to work. So anyway, we now next week, on October 5th, we are launching a program with the same partner to train 1,000 young people online using the same methods that we were using with our alumni. And why for me this is important is because sometimes if maybe we would have given up when we were told that it couldn't work in Jan, but also the same thing that you know, Jean-Michel just said, that believe in your team, right? Make sure that you know your team, because I keep telling my team that every time there's a problem, I tell them, yeah, we teach people problem solving. So if you have a problem, it's now our job to solve it. So let's show that we can solve this problem. So I'm really, I think that when I think about this pandemic and what has happened with it, I also look at how much work we've been able to do and how much we've been able to achieve that I don't think we would have been able to if we hadn't been forced to go into a lockdown. So yeah, it's been very interesting, and I know that now for sure, I know that for sure we are not going back to how we used to do things, and that we'll probably move like 80-90% of our trainings online even after this. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Benjamin. And again, it's a great example of how you've turned a crisis into an opportunity. You've said, actually, this is a new way of doing things. I'm going to embrace that. And I've heard that from all of you this afternoon. Really fascinating. I wanted to ask a couple of questions before I open it up to the questions from social media and from our audience today. The first question is, when I talk about crisis at the beginning, I deliberately didn't mention COVID-19 because actually I think the crisis is far more complicated than that. COVID-19 may have been the catalyst for it, but actually there's been a whole range of movements that have found an even stronger voice as a result of the last 6 months, whether it be Black Lives Matter or indeed the climate conversation. Those issues have been important for some time, but I think they've gained even further prominence over that 6-month period. And I'm always very conscious as a white man of the need to step out of my privilege when having this kind of conversation. But I do feel it's important to reference, certainly, first of all, Black Lives Matter. Speaking from a sort of Western European point of view, I suppose, a lot of the debate around this has been, surely, for example, in the UK, it can't be as bad as it is in America. You know, this isn't the kind of society we come from. The reality, of course, is that Britain's colonial past says something quite different. And of course, our relationship with Africa has been a very challenging one for some time. And I think it's organisations like Queen's Commonwealth Trust that are really reshaping those conversations into much more positive and constructive ones. But I'd love to hear your perspectives on how you've seen the Black Lives Matter movement, perhaps once removed from some of those cradles of agitation, in some cases violence, but in many cases really constructive debate. So perhaps if I can come to you, Edem, for your perspective on how that's been happening from where you are.
I really love that question because you know, it's the real issue, right? It's the meat of the conversation, which is what is the deeper crisis, the deeper context behind the COVID crisis? For me, for instance, in the education landscape, and I'll marry this with your final question, which is, how to reflect on the Black Lives Movement and generally the concept of justice, social justice. But in the context of my work as an education activist, I found that COVID-19 was beyond a health crisis to a real revelation of the fact that Africa is no way primed to achieve education for all. The forced closure of schools, for instance, made us really come to a reckoning about the digital divide. What category of children can access a teacher without being able to walk into a classroom? And we find that there's a very tiny minority population that will be able to continue learning beyond the classroom. In the event, as we witnessed, that schools are locked down, that schools are closed, is there a child somewhere who cannot access a teacher? Apparently, a majority of the school-aged population cannot access teachers beyond the physical classroom. This is already, against the backdrop of the fact that even without a crisis, we don't have sufficient classrooms to accommodate every child. We have a population explosion. We have a youth demographic that is bulging. So suddenly the school-age population is far greater than what we contemplated a decade ago. Unfortunately, infrastructural development has not kept up pace with population growth. And also new technologies that allow people to still access services are not, being incorporated in African settings in a manner that, also ensures that education services cut across all the boundaries and divides. Africa in the last decade has witnessed an upsurge in internally displaced populations. War, conflicts, natural disasters have forced many people to leave their homes. These groups of individuals live in temporary camps and shelters, and there's not adequate arrangements being made for the classroom or the teacher to reach the children there. Unfortunately, the poor distribution of broadband internet facilities, African children don't have data penetration in their communities. And the more you get to the fringe parts of cities or peri-urban areas, the more you get to the rural populations, you find that there's no contact at all with broadband. So how are they going to be able to access, the online classroom, the blended classroom? These are the real issues. Of course, beyond, the health, toga behind COVID, these things came to the fore in this, context. So it began a conversation among stakeholders about what real measures do we need to put in place? What new strategies does Africa need to embrace? What is the new kind of policy that Africa needs to put in place to ensure education for all? Whether it's an economic policy, what kind of payment structures need to be created to ensure that education travels beyond classrooms and gets into the deepest hinterland parts of the continent to reach the child wherever they are. This requires a new kind of economic framework. This requires a new kind of policy and thinking. And so these are the real conversations. What kind of partnerships will Africa have to, embark upon going forward to ensure that these, this objective or this agenda is actually attained or realized? Whether it's public-private sector partnerships, whether it's partnerships with, foreign allies, what new partnerships must be struck? How do we work with communities? How do we work with non-governmental organizations and civil society participants to ensure that the goal at the end of the day is realized? And then to the larger question of social justice, the concept of social justice, which ensures that every human being born in any society is capable of pursuing happiness. And what does that translate to? Am I able to develop in a manner that makes me competent to function and to thrive in that environment? Do I have access to all the protections, to all the services that guarantee my full participation? These are the real conversations, and this ties to the Black Lives Movement. So at the global level, the murder that we witnessed of George Floyd forced the entire world to come face to face with man's inhumanity to man. On an African divide, on the African side, the enemy is not necessarily the white man. For instance, I, as a Nigerian citizen, I'm not going to point to all my, disadvantages as the failures of the white man. Yes, we have issues unresolved in terms of state building processes brought about by virtue of, colonial constructs. And yes, those realities are there. The ways we were coalesced into nationhoods is still affected. They lie at the roots of some of the challenges we've had in our failures to form, a cohesive state. Yes, that conversation is there. But when you look at the broader conversation of social justice, of compassion in systems, of diversity and inclusion, of, equal opportunity, At the end of the day, the hostile enemy, quote and unquote, or the aggressor, or the person denying me of my rights is a fellow Black individual. Perhaps it's an individual from the same tribe that I come from. So this forces us to have a complete introspective look at the systems that we've created for ourselves, and how, where you exist in a construct where you cannot label another, individual belonging to another identity or race as the person, responsible for your failures, then it forces you to look at yourself, and stop being a cultural apologist. One of the things we find in African, in the Nigerian context, is that we point to most of our failures as relics or legacies from the colonial, construct. And I do agree that if you search, to the roots of many of these challenges, yes, fundamentally, the construction of nationhood lies at the roots of, many challenges. However, at some point, a human being is responsible to, attain a level of cognitive awareness to say, here is my challenge. How do I navigate and bring about the best outcomes for myself despite my challenge? And it is become evident that in Africa, the reason why corruption reigns is not because, somebody appointed a governor for me, or some colonial, authority forced a governor on me. But corruption reigns because I have failed, neglected, or omitted to set in place the right kinds of mechanisms to allow for proper elective processes to guarantee that the right individuals emerge and represent us. Or I have failed to set in place proper mechanisms to hold these individuals representing my interests accountable for the, the dividends of the so-called democracy. So these are the larger conversations that Black Lives Movement has forced on us. What is the death measure? Another conversation is, yes, on the one side, I pointed to the fact that the enemy does not lie with, without, the enemy lies within. The second context of the introspection for us is, what is the death measure of corruption? What is the death measure? So George Floyd's incident resulted in the death of an individual, right? And oftentimes when we look at development and its failure, we talk about, some people being disadvantaged. But it forced us to face, come face to face with the reckoning that it's not just a case of disadvantage, it's a case of complete truncation or termination of a prospect or a potential. You can call it death in quotes. The death of potential, the death of prospects is actually what we're faced with. If a child does not live to a certain age and child mortality is a problem, then that's as a result of failures, whether it's corruption, whether it's grand theft, whatever it is, it results in death. That these things that we create, these systems that we create actually, deny us the blessings that we could realize from the fullness of the potential of every citizen. When we erect barriers for people's full participation, whether it's from a gender context, whether it's from a tribal or any other kind of identity that we have put at the foundations of denials of, and created oppressive systems around, what that translates to is also economic loss. So it is real social development. It's a moral question. It's also an economic question. It is a moral question because as human beings, we cannot live like animals. It is an economic question because we deny ourselves the full contribution measure that these individuals could have brought to the table, assuming these barriers did not exist. So these are some of the things that we have, come face to face with in the context of the Black Lives Movement and around the COVID-19, situation.
Thank you, Edem. It's such a powerful mosaic that you've painted for us there in terms of how all these different challenges are interconnected, whether it be social justice, whether it be climate, whether it be Black Lives Matter, and of course COVID-19 is the kind of face of that, or a catalyst towards some of those things. And there's part of what you talked about there that I want to come on to ask Jean-Michel and Benjamin about before we take questions. And that's around partnerships. So you mentioned partnerships. SDG number 17 is about partnerships. Are we seeing partnerships emerge on the ground in situ, in Africa, across Africa, that are helping to forge solutions, or is it too soon? And Jean-Michel, I want to come to you first.
Are we seeing partnerships? I think that, first of all, it's a necessity. I think that the times of, people from around, from Western countries to come and decide that this is what needs to happen is over. Because I think the problem with that is like a certain level of arrogance to think that we on the ground are not doing much or not understanding what really is happening. But I think it's not, it needs to go beyond just the presence of, you know, partnership, but it's also what kind of partnership are we building? Is it, anyone who runs an organization, so a nonprofit organization here, you will notice that that partnership might be there, but it's a paternalistic partnership, right? Where on both sides, to be honest, on one side we bend too early, and we think because the person has money, then it means that they know best what needs to be done. And then the second thing is, it's also understanding that we bring something to the table. I think understanding that we have something that we're bringing that many of them do not know. So I'll give you an example. A lot of the partnerships that we work with are people who are, you know, either debate organizations around the world or people who run debate programs. But in comparison, none of them have done what we have done. Because part of what they don't understand is they come in a culture that it's almost very suitable for them to be able to do what they do. So they don't fight all the cultural, they don't fight all the bigger, restraints, all the bigger frustrations that you have to deal with. And for them, it kind of seems like it's an easy thing, right? It's an easy thing, it should be done quickly. When the job that we're doing, some of it's jobs that maybe people did 100 or 200 years ago, that they came in and they're sort of enjoying the benefits of it, right? So for me, it's able to be, to tell them like, no, what we're doing is far bigger than what you are thinking. But then secondly, being able to say, you know what, I would actually love for you to help us in this place. I believe in a partnership of equality. And what that means, it means that we can both come to the table and feel like we have something to bring about, and also come to the table and be able to say, you're coming to serve my vision. You're coming to serve the way that I see the world, and that's how it should work. And I think that for me is far more powerful. It means that all of us have something that we bring, and none is better than the other. And and for me, that's why we've been really careful in seeing who do we engage with. And sometimes even being able to say, you know what, keep your money or keep whatever, we'll be fine. Like, we'll be totally fine. But it's accepting a partnership of equals. So I think that's what needs to happen. Otherwise, it's just going to end up being like we're wasting money, wasting time, because somebody somewhere, you know, some 20-year-olds, some 20-year-old person is a technocrat, is sitting somewhere and deciding that the most important issue in Africa is this, when they don't really have the cultural nuance to be able to know, hey, actually that's not how it goes. So that's where the future is. I believe in partner. I mean, it's all about all of us bringing something to the table, and that needs to happen. And a lot of African entrepreneurs can tell you how frustrating it is, especially when you're still small and you're not speaking the language that people want to hear, right? If you don't use all the big buzzwords, everyone thinks that you don't really understand, when most of the time you probably do. You probably do better than most people would admit. But yeah, I think those partnerships need to happen, but those partnerships need to be partnerships that are different. And I think it's us who refuse sometimes and take the risk of saying, you know, for the sake of actually building a world that is far more just, and for the sake of building a world where, you know, every kid can stand up and be anywhere and they're fine, we'll refuse certain partnerships that are paternalistic.
Thanks so much, Jean-Michel. Really interesting. So talking about coming to the table, but also being prepared to walk away from that table if the partnership isn't based on the right values, if they're not shared, and if there isn't some kind of equality there. And I love what you said about Western intervention is over. That is going to be a really interesting battleground, I think, for the coming months going into 2021. I do feel that 2020 has been a sort of crucible of the crisis. Clearly, there's going to be impacts and legacies that speak to the coming years. And it's hard to predict at this stage how long that tail will last, but I suspect it will be quite significant. Benjamin, I want to come to you and just get a better understanding of, in the Ugandan context, what sort of partnerships are you seeing? Are you seeing people coming to the table?
Again, thank you, guys. I feel like this for me also points to what are we learning, right? I think that this, you know, Black Lives Matter, but also the economic injustice, which I think sits at the heart of this debate, points to what are we learning, or what do we need to be learning, or what do young people in our schools, the young people that we work with, what do they need to be learning? Because I think that so many times there's the risk that we are replicating the same models and systems that in our work that we are complaining about, and purporting to be breaking. I don't know if that makes sense, right? That it's so easy for me to sit here and say in an ideal situation, I want to be the custodian of my future and the vision for Africa. Yet my work with Boundless does not represent that I am imposing what I want or what that vision should look like on others that we work with, because we don't come or we don't sit, in the same economic structure. So I think that there's a risk of that, but also importantly is what it is that we are learning. So if you think about Black Lives Matter, for example, how much of these economic injustices and the effect that they have do the young people in our schools know about, right? And I'd say very, very little. And sometimes we tend to think that it's deliberate, but I don't know if it is. I don't know if it's just that we haven't put in the work to make this possible. But I think that in terms of, not to repeat the things that Jean-Michel was talking about in terms of partnerships that are respectful, that are mutual, that are respectful of context, that those partnerships, especially in I don't think it's just Uganda, it's probably around the continent, that if you do not control capital, you're always going to be coming into these sorts of relationships at a disadvantage, right? Because what you have to offer versus the capital that you need for it might not always match, even if you think that they do. It might not always match. So I think that for us to get to a point where we achieve economic justice, we need to get to a point where we have some leverage in terms of the capital that we bring to the table, basically. So, and how do we create that is by investing more in our young people, in the ideas of young people, in their innovations, in getting them to feel validated. Because if we don't do that, they'll never feel like equals in whatever relationships they get into. So it's always, whatever partnerships exist, will always be imbalanced. So do I see those sorts of things happening now? I actually worry that because of what has happened over the last 6 months, the situation might even have gotten worse than it ever has been, because even indigenous corporate companies that would ideally invest in shifting this situation, I think aren't doing as well as they were doing last year. So they might be they might not be as enthusiastic to engage in the way that they were. So I think the discussion for us, or the question for us, is how do we get to a point where, like, what is it that we need to do to own our own capital? Because I think that, for me, might actually be the start to freeing the mind, to creating partnerships and relationships of mutual respect and understanding, to creating relationships where we have our destiny in our hands. And I worry that the last 6 months might have actually done damage to those prospects. So it's going to be, we're going to have to put in double the work we were putting in now to make this work. This issue of dealing with economic injustice work. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Benjamin. Two really important points I think you've sort of expanded on there. One, obviously, is what should we be learning? And for me, this often comes back to history. You talked about not replicating those same models that have caused us difficulties in the past. And it really links directly with your second point around owning capital, having ownership over our own destinies. I think that, of course, is directly linked to the quality of our education. You've all spoken about that very passionately today. And there's a danger that we have a lost generation of young people that haven't had the opportunity in schools, or as you say, the gap is widening between those that have access to technology and resource outside of traditional schooling as it has been until now, and what it may look like in the future. Benjamin, did you want to quickly come back in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, for example, in Uganda, you have 70% of the children that enroll in primary school do not complete, right? So 7 years. So in a space of 7 years, you lose 70% of the children that enrolled, right? And that number also goes, at the next level is 4 years, that number also drops even lower. So if you have 1 million children enrolling in primary school, about 15 years later, when they have to join university, you'll probably have only 100,000 of them joining. So you've lost about 900,000, right? And the challenges, the reasons for that is poverty, right? Systemic poverty and injustice that means that only those that can afford the means get to the highest point, right? But it also is reflected in, for example, where, let's say, the young girls that get pregnant or get sexually abused and are unable to stay in school, but they are also unable to access justice, even as a result, right? Because justice is also given to those that have the means to access it, right? So if you think about things like that and think about what has happened over the last 6 months in which children have not been at school, right? So it's possible that even when we reopen schools, yeah, that the percentage of those that show up back in school is going to be much, much lower than we have ever experienced anywhere on the continent.
Really powerful, Benjamin. Thank you for that. And on that note, I wanted to take us into questions. So my colleague Naomi at Queen's Commonwealth Trust, I think, is going to initially field any questions that we've had from social media. And then if there are any other questions that come in, please do type them into the chat box throughout the session. So Naomi, what have we had through so far?
We've had some really good questions coming in on social media. The first one is just taking it back to basics, I guess, and asking what is actually meant by the term leadership, and how does one become a leader? Thanks so much, Naomi.
So for these questions, I'm going to come to one of you only, in the interest of getting through as many questions as we can, so we can engage with the audience as far as possible. On this one, Edem, can I come to you? So what is leadership to you?
So for me, it's very simple, really. After many years of navigating it, I think I was able to articulate it in the simplest terms for myself as the capacity to influence somebody or people to positive lines of action. Whenever I find myself in a space where I'm influencing another individual towards a better outcome, I'm exercising leadership. If I envision a better future and I communicate it to somebody, I say, let's do this. It is achievable, it is possible. Here's what we need to do. What are your thoughts? Let's deliberate, let's put ideas together, but let's act. I'm exercising leadership. So I just generally consider leadership as, influencing people to positive lines of actions, to positive to do things that lead to better outcomes. So whether it's in a political sphere, whether it's in a workplace setting, whether it's in a family context, the minute I find myself or you find yourself demonstrating these steps, I do believe you're exercising leadership. And to the second part of the question, what does it take to become a leader? I, at the end of the day, have also discovered very critical for me in my personal journey has been one, self-awareness. Embarking on that journey of discovering who I am, what drives me, what are my passions, what excites me, what troubles me, what aggravates me was my first step. What irritates me, and then a complete external awareness of as well, recognizing the environment, recognizing the gaps, recognizing the challenges, being empathetic, being able to walk in somebody's shoes or to relate with the challenges another person is going to. When I married those two experiences, the experience of self-awareness and the experience of total external awareness, studying my environment, being in tune with my environment, knowing what it demands at a particular time, then I'm able to plug myself in the gaps and see where best I fit. I find that leaders who embark on these two things, of course, this is a complete oversimplification. There are many tools that you will need to build. You will need to acquire communication skills, team building skills. So, but for me, I can lay them on across these two foundations. I find that I can begin to erect other, structures of what steps I need to take or what tools I need to gain to do better leadership. But I find that if you take that time to do an introspection, to know who you are, what do you want to accomplish in the world? What do you want to give as a legacy to the world? And then what does the world require at this time? What is leadership in COVID? Is not leadership without COVID, for instance. So the external environment in a COVID scenario is completely and radically different from the external environment post-COVID or prior to COVID, right? So the environment is demanding certain critical things in that moment, in that construct. So that's why those two things need to be married. Again, please, a caveat, this is a complete oversimplification. There are deeper information and insights to gather. But if you embark on these two exercises, you will get the knowledge and the steps to be taken per time.
Thanks so much, Edem. I really want to give you a virtual high five. Obviously, for so many reasons, I can't do that, but really, really powerful answer, absolutely. Naomi, on to our second question.
Yes, so second question is, what are some of the challenges that we will face as young leaders?
Very interesting. And of course, you all work with those young leaders. So what do we think some of those challenges might look like? Jean-Michel, I'm going to come to you for that question.
The challenges first of all, is the lack of experience. I think that you're going to young people who are known for passion. You're very passionate, but you don't have the experience, so you don't actually know what works and what doesn't, which can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. It can be a good thing because that's when you create your path. And I think it also removes the limitation, because if you don't know that things are not done in this way, you would do it however you feel you want to do it. That's the first one, the lack of experience. And I think experience is important because I see it now that I have a few years in the game, that now the younger guys, when they come, they do things and I'm like, that's not how it's supposed to be done. But the first one is experience. The second thing is you're not going to be taken seriously, especially in the African culture where there's a respect for elders. And elders are always right. You never question an elder is always right. So you will never be taken seriously. And what I usually tell all my young leaders is, I give them, I quote the Bible, it says that do not let anyone look down on you because you're young, but be an example in conduct and in behavior. So the fact that those challenges are there, they are actually good. I think that I hear a lot of young people complaining about how, well, I'll not be taken seriously. I think sometimes it's, yes, that will not happen. In whatever century you live in, it will never happen. But part of it is you have an opportunity to prove yourself. And if you do the right thing and you give results, people will listen to you.
Thanks so much, Jean-Michel. Naomi, do we have a third question?
Yes, we do. The third question is, what are the shortfalls of leadership?
Interesting. Really obviously tied to what Jean-Michel was saying there. So Benjamin, can you tell us a bit more about any shortfalls in leadership that you've seen in your context and perhaps how they've been overcome, if they have?
So this is kind of related to what Jean-Michel just talked about. I think that leadership is also in context, right? That and the challenges that we face is that it's not static. Leaders are expected to grow, right? So let me say, for example, I founded Boundless 3 years ago, and if the organization is growing, I am not expected to be where I was when Boundless was founded. And I find that sometimes that for that to happen, you need an environment in which you're growing, right? You need an environment that cultivates this growth process. And that environment also requires things like mentorship. It requires access to knowledge and resources. It requires even the mindset itself for you to want to grow. And a lot of times, we might not have those things. So I'll give, again, an example of Boundless. When we had just started out, someone asked, why do you have people that are much older on your board? Like, the difference between the work that you do and the people on your board is really high. Like, why aren't there young people on your board? And you say, but you see, we work in a context in which young people don't get the respect that they deserve. So you need people of a certain age on your board for you to be able to, look like your organization is very responsible, even if there are younger people who could be more valuable for the board and know what is required, and yet you have to strike those balances. So I find that when you're starting out as the founder, sometimes you have to basically work within the context that you have, and that asks a lot of you, because those contexts might differ for other people. And if they don't understand, for example, because we were having this discussion with a partner, and it's because they didn't understand the context in which we were working. They didn't understand that if I walked into a corporate company boardroom and they looked at our governance structure and found a board of high-flying 20 or 30-year-olds, even if that's good for the organization, the corporate company might not understand, yeah? Because for them, there's an ageism thing accompanying leadership. It's, the idea that you can't be a leader or take responsibility if you are of a certain age. So I think that the challenges for leaders especially are that how do you balance contexts where you have to create all of these partnerships, but some of those partnerships don't appreciate the context in which you're working. Yeah, it's the same thing with fundraising. For example, the idea that for you to raise funding as an organization, you need to have been in operation for some time, right? And yet for you to operate for some time, you need funding. So those contradictions are the ones that leaders, especially founders, have to grapple with. And I don't know if there is a way around them, apart from simply waking up and doing the work that you have committed to do, and learning and improving yourself, and building partnerships of value, and sticking to what you must, so that you solve the challenges that you face. Not because otherwise, the alternative is to give up. But even when you do, that doesn't mean that the challenges go away.
Thanks so much, Benjamin. That's super helpful, and it speaks to the structural challenges that exist, as well as, of course, individuals challenges. And Naomi, did we have any more questions on social media?
They're the ones that have come through on social, but I've seen some come up in the chat.
How many questions do we have on the chat?
We've got 2.
Fantastic. Would you be able to read out the first one?
Yeah, so the first one is focusing on, so in Africa, they've said that there's 80 million individuals who are living with disabilities. And do you see any hopes in terms of achieving a more inclusive society, leveraging young leadership models in Africa?
Thanks, Naomi. Really interesting. Who from the panel would like to comment on that question?
So there's a specific question directed at me. I'll therefore pass on this first one so that I can focus on the next one and not hog the stage.
Perfect. Thanks, Edem. So Benjamin or Jean-Michel, who'd like to come in on the disabilities question?
I can. I think that there's going to be, I think a few things need to change in order to have a more inclusive society. I think when we talk mainly from the on the African continent, I think we have a lot of superstitions and we have a lot of beliefs that basically hinder any sort of inclusivity. So when a parent has a child with disability, instead of them understanding that there's actually medical treatment for that, or there are different ways of understanding what happened to the child, many of them would take it as witchcraft from the in-laws, or they will take it as some sort of gods punishing them. So I think that the first part that will need to happen is a raising of awareness that is going to allow for many people all over the world, by the way, to be able to understand that actually these are things that could be treated. The second thing that I think is going to be important is having people be exposed to their blind. So all of us are blindfolded, whether we want it or not. The fact that, for example, I'm able-bodied means that when I look at the stairs, I don't think that someone who's not able to walk, maybe that's a different challenge that they have. And part of what we really want to do is to figure out the young people who are, because I know many organizations, at least here in Rwanda, that are working in that area, and for them to make a little bit of noise and for them to be given a platform to talk. Because I think demonizing anyone else as being, anti this, anti that is just, first of all, is counterproductive. But secondly, it's also not understanding the way human beings are created. So it's not that you are against any sort of people, or that it's just that you have blinds. All of us have blinds. We have things that we don't see because we are particular beings living in a particular environment, a particular time. So it means that some of the things that we're not able to see, and we advocate for policies that work for us or the people that act like us. So being able to have people who live with disabilities, being able to be given the infrastructure in place for that. So whenever we're building buildings, for that to be a requirement, but then also for schools, right? I have a friend who works in special education, and there are many parents who didn't know that there is such a thing, right? And it's only in Rwanda, for example, it's only the rich that have access to that. So if we can figure out a way for governments to be able to fund some of those programs that help with people with disabilities, and then match it with an awareness raising campaign that explains that there are different ways that we can logically explain these things to solve it, then we're dealing with the problem at 2 different levels. If we have an approach that doesn't have both, it is going to fail, for sure. We can't underestimate how entrenched some of these views are, but I also think that it's possible to change those views, because many things have changed. Campaigns that changed behaviors in terms of AIDS, in terms of, all of these different things that we are now seeing as history, they didn't happen overnight. It was work that was done by a lot of organizations to raise awareness and also provide the funding and the policies necessary to make it work.
Thanks so much, Jean-Michel. I also think it speaks to this concept of allyship as well, and of us working together. When we talk about diversity and inclusion, Black Lives Matter, people with disabilities, LGBTQ people, women's rights, all these issues are part of that kind of maelstrom that we're dealing with right now. And I think, again, if we work together as communities, we're able to achieve change more effectively than if we're splintered apart. And Naomi, if I can go to you for perhaps our final question of the session.
Yeah, sure. So this one is for Edem. And the question is, what are some of the first steps in engaging African women on the front lines of decision-making in a culture that has not supported that for a long time?
So thank you, Dan, for asking that very important question. I think it also speaks to the moment. A lot of what we have said has revolved around social justice for everyone, and we've identified various groupings or profiles of the society that have, been at the margins, women being one of those, brackets. I think one of the things we need to do as a first step is a complete and total recognition of what stage we are in terms of whether you call it progress or in terms of whether you call it reality. And Jean-Michel alluded to this when he, in his earlier contribution, when he talked about the cultural disparity between investors and the fact that somebody comes from a completely different investment climate and, does not appreciate the nuances of a new or the, visiting investment climate, failing to recognize, the stages of progress that have been made in his or her own environment that he is benefiting from. What the principle of that statement for me represented is that progress comes in stages. And at every critical point in time, everyone must evaluate the stage of progress we are at. One of the things I find in the gender movement or the women's movement in Africa is a tendency to, mischaracterize the stage of progress that we are in. Now, we live in an era of the affirmative action. We live in an era of the quota system where, for instance, because of the interconnectedness of the world, the multilateral systems of the world, and conditionalities imposed by world systems. Like, for instance, the UN would place conditions on governments and say, if you want to access a certain program or grant, whatever, you have to make sure that this percentage of women are elected into your National Assembly. So we are in that era where women are given, more rights into the space by virtue of a lot of these conditionalities. Unfortunately, there's a tendency to assume a cultural shift because there's an appearance of more participation of women. I find in Africa that, yes, when you look at the public scene and the landscape, yes, there's more women outside the home front now. There's more women in the workplace. There's more women gaining CEO positions, gaining invitations to serve on boards. There's more women definitely in elected offices than we had perhaps a decade or 2 decades ago. However, the backbone of these, participation of women is what we need to investigate or to examine. Is this appearance or this, shift riding on cultural attitudes changing? Is this, sudden involvement of women in the workplace, in politics, and in other spheres where we find their participation increasing? Is it as a result of attitudes changing? Are men and spouses in the home front, for instance, more supportive of their wives working, longer hours in an executive position, traveling out of town with male counterparts or colleagues for an office retreat, or joining political parties, running for political offices, braving violent crowds, doing campaigns, and then serving in elected offices, going into male-dominated elected positions where, you have to come head-to-head with male colleagues in either lawmaking chambers or cabinet positions? Is this sudden participation of women supported by these cultural attitudes? I think that when we interrogate African attitudes, whether it's, family attitudes at home, we don't find a corresponding shift in attitudes that would support these changes. And again, society becomes divided along income lines, along city geographical lines. The more you exist in a city context, the more there's likelihood of you being open to your wife or your female sister or whatever working in an office. The more you go into the rural communities that are still largely agrarian or agriculture driven, you find that there's still more resistance or existing resistance to women going into public domains. So Africa needs to be conscious of the profiles that exist within its, society, and not think that we are not a monolithic society. We are completely heterogeneous in vocations, in income levels, and unfortunately at every level of vocation or income participation, there's a certain kind of culture that shapes the attitudes of participants in that setting. We need to make sure that the enlightenment about gender equality travels across all the spaces to ensure that we're carrying every segment of the society along in the changes, and then that whatever real, removal of the barriers transcends every boundary. It is not something that exists only in the cities or amongst the rich bracket or the high income, net worth individuals of the society. So that's the first step. The first step is recognizing where we are. and completely making certain that the sensitization and enlightenment campaigns travel across all divides. Secondly, tackling the situation from early ages. And as we focus a lot of attention on the girl child, there is what is happening. There's a trend currently where there's a neglect of, similar reorientation programs or acculturation happening for the boy child. As we train the girl child to accommodate the possibility that she can be a leader, to shape her competencies for science, technology, engineering, mathematics fields, to aspire and to no longer dread the word ambition as though it is a dirty word, we have to also raise the counterpart boy child to see that it is very okay for the girl to fly and be ambitious, for them to later form families. Otherwise, we place women in positions or situations where they can only succeed in isolation. Africa is presenting too many examples of women who are having to do a trade-off between career success or family life. We have made, ambitions, we've placed women in situations where there's a tension between their career ambitions or their public life goals and their goals for family life. And this is because these goals are not supported by cultures and attitudes. So women, as I represent that, profile, no woman wants to succeed in isolation of the people that they love. We want to succeed in the company of our spouses, our children, and our family members. Africa needs to make sure that we have that support and we don't get to a point where we feel like we are faced with a silent ultimatum. To progress on one side, we have to, compromise on the other, or there's no balance. We are not yet at the point of attaining balance or integrating our desires on the family end with our public goal aspirations. And that's where I think the focus has to be on. The real change in attitudes is not yet happening, at a scalable level on the continent. We're focused so much on the affirmative action and putting women in positions and counting those figures as though they represent the real changes that we need to see.
Thanks so much, Edem. And I think obviously it's important to note at this point that in the week that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the pioneering Supreme Court Justice, died, that this debate should be included in amongst those debates that are at the heart of this crisis. It's been a fascinating afternoon. Thank you so much, all of you. I think we're all very privileged. I feel very privileged to have been in your presence to hear these debates around Black Lives Matter, around gender equality, COVID, pulling all of this together, climate, and of course the opportunities and perils of leadership and how modern 21st century leadership looks or doesn't look today, and perhaps how it should look in the future. So lots to unpick here. I wish we had more time. Unfortunately, we don't, but I would love to be able to speak to all of you again and hear from your insights. And I'm sure that Naomi and colleagues at Queen's Commonwealth Trust would agree that it's been a fantastic platform, and we'd love to provide more platforms for you and our audience to be able to contribute, because this debate is for all of us. So thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.